Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, far beyond the sleek lines of modern machinery, beyond the glow of electric lights, to a world shaped by muscle, fire, and raw iron. We're plunging into the grime and grit of the medieval age, a time when life was, well, pretty rough for almost everyone. But for one particular craftsman, often romanticized in stories and legends, life was truly a daily battle against the elements, exhaustion, and constant danger. Tonight, we're going to talk about the miserable life of a medieval blacksmith. And let me tell you, if you were a blacksmith back then, you probably wouldn't survive this. At least, not with all your teeth or your hearing intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you stumbled out of your humble dwelling each morning, your life as a medieval blacksmith would be defined by the daily grind and endless toil. There was no concept of an 8-hour workday, no weekends, and certainly no paid vacation. Your work began with the rising sun, and it rarely ended until dusk, often stretching into the flickering light of oil lamps if there was urgent work to be done. It was a relentless, repetitive cycle of physical exertion, demanding every ounce of your strength and endurance, day after day, year after year. Imagine stepping into your smithy before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. The first task of your day, every day, would be to coax life back into the dying embers of your forge. You'd rake the coals, add fresh charcoal, and then begin the laborious process of working the bellows. Each push and pull of the bellows was a heavy effort, gradually building the heat, feeling the sweat already begin to trickle down your back even before you picked up your first hammer. This wasn't just turning on a switch, it was a physical commitment to fire, repeated every single morning. Once the forge glowed a vibrant orange, your real work began. You'd grab a piece of raw iron, often heavy and unyielding, and thrust it into the inferno. The waiting, the precise timing, then the rhythmic, bone-jarring impact of hammer on hot metal. Again and again, you'd strike, turn the metal, strike again, shaping, bending, stretching the stubborn iron, whether you were forging a simple horseshoe for a farmer's weary beast, sharpening a plowshare for the spring planting, or hammering out a sturdy hinge for a manor gate. The process was fundamentally the same brute force combined with learned skill, applied endlessly. Your work was dictated by the needs of your community. Farmers needed tools, knights needed armor and weapons, though specialized armorers existed. General blacksmiths still did a lot of repair. Housewives needed cooking implements, and every building needed nails and fittings. The demand was constant, varied, and immediate. You couldn't say. I'll get to it next week. If a farmer's plow broke during planting season, or a castle gate needed repair before an approaching lord, your work became a matter of urgent necessity, often requiring you to push past the limits of exhaustion. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this endless toil is the reliance on manual power for everything in the medieval era. There were no machines powered by external sources beyond watermills or windmills, which rarely powered smithies directly. Every hammer blow, every stroke of the bellows, every piece of metal shaped, was a direct result of human muscle. This meant that the sheer volume of output depended entirely on the physical endurance of the blacksmith and any apprentices they might have. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that the village blacksmith was often also the impromptu veterinarian for farm animals, especially horses. A lame horse meant a crippled harvest. So you, the blacksmith, were expected to not only shoe horses but also sometimes diagnose their ailments, a job rarely mentioned in romantic tales. Imagine trying to explain to a stubborn warhorse that this is going to hurt a little bit. It's a testament to the broad, demanding skill set. Historians still argue whether the relentless physical demands of medieval blacksmithing led to a shorter average lifespan primarily due to direct injury, or more so from the cumulative effects of chronic fatigue and environmental exposure. Either way, you weren't living to a ripe old age. Your days were literally hammered out, one strike at a time, until your body simply couldn't keep up. So, your days were a brutal rhythm of hammer and bellows. But the toll wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the very environment you inhabited. Your workplace, the smithy, wasn't a pristine modern factory. It was a smelly, smoky, dangerous workshop that relentlessly assaulted your senses and chipped away at your health with every passing hour. Imagine stepping into your smithy. The air would immediately hit you thick, acrid, and heavy. The primary fuel for your forge was charcoal, which, while burning hotter and cleaner than raw wood, still produced significant amounts of carbon monoxide and fine particulate matter. As you constantly stoked the fire and plunged hot metal into water, steam would hiss and billow, mingling with the charcoal smoke, creating a perpetual haze. Your eyes would sting, your throat would feel raw, and the smell of burning coal, hot metal, and your own sweat would cling to your clothes and skin like a second skin. It's like working in a permanent, industrial-strength barbecue. But with added health hazards, the heat was oppressive. Even in winter, the forge, constantly stoked to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, radiated an intense, dry heat that made your small workshop a sweltering oven. In summer, it was simply unbearable. With temperatures inside the smithy often far exceeding the ambient air, making every breath feel like drawing in fire, you'd be perpetually covered in sweat, which would mix with the grime and soot, creating a constant layer of discomfort. There was no air conditioning, no industrial fans, just the open doors if you were lucky and the slight draft from your bellows. And then there was the noise, the relentless, jarring sound of hammer striking anvil, clang, 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 hour after hour, day after day. This wasn't a gentle tapping. It was a resonant, metallic thunderclap that echoed through the confined space of your smithy. Added to this was the sizzle of quenching, the roar of the bellows, and the occasional clang of dropping tools. Your workshop was a cacophony, a relentless assault on your ears that would slowly, inexorably, dull your hearing over time. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the danger of this environment is the ubiquitous presence of open flames and red-hot metal. Your forge was a constant source of extreme heat, and every piece of iron you worked with was glowing hot. Tools lay scattered, some still radiating heat. The risk of accidental burns was not just high, it was a daily certainty. Minor burns were a part of the job, and major, disfiguring burns were always a hair's breadth away. You learned to move with a wary respect for the heat, knowing one wrong step could mean agonizing pain and a trip to the local, probably unqualified, healer. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that the village children would often gather outside the smithy, drawn by the mesmerizing glow of the forge and the sparks flying from the anvil, while seemingly innocent. This exposed them to the same smoke and noise. Though for shorter periods, imagine trying to shoo away curious kids from your incredibly dangerous workstation. Knowing a stray spark could cause a serious injury. It's a testament to the lack of safety awareness. Historians still argue whether the constant exposure to charcoal smoke and metal dust contributed more to respiratory diseases or to shorter life expectancies among blacksmiths, or if it was the cumulative effect of all these environmental stressors. Regardless, your smithy was a monument to medieval industry, but also a crucible of human suffering. It was a place of creation, yes, but also a slow, steady destroyer of health. So, the smithy itself was a relentless assault on your senses and your lungs. But the most direct and undeniable consequence of your profession was the physical toll on your body. Blacksmithing wasn't just a job. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of your physical well-being, a constant battle against strain, injury, and the relentless wear and tear of repetitive, heavy labor. Imagine your hands, calloused, scarred, often blistered, and perpetually grimy. The constant vibration from the hammer blows, the heat from the metal, and the sheer force required to manipulate iron would leave your fingers gnarled, your knuckles swollen, and your grip aching. You might develop painful conditions like carpal tunnel syndrome or severe arthritis long before your time, making even simple tasks excruciating. These weren't just the hands of a craftsman, they were the hands of a warrior, constantly engaged in a silent, brutal fight against the unyielding nature of metal. Now, consider your back and shoulders. Every swing of the hammer, especially the heavy sledgehammer used for initial shaping, put immense strain on your spine and the powerful muscles of your upper body. You'd be constantly bending, lifting, twisting, and striking, often with awkward postures to get the right angle on the metal. This repetitive stress, day after day, would lead to chronic back pain, slipped discs, and shoulder injuries. You might wake up every morning feeling like you'd already done a full day's work, your body protesting even before you stepped into the smithy. It's like being a perpetual weightlifter, but without the proper form, the rest days, or the protein shakes. Your legs and feet wouldn't be spared either, standing for hours on end, often on uneven or hard surfaces, near intense heat, would lead to swollen ankles, aching arches, and chronic foot pain. The occasional dropped piece of hot metal or a misplaced hammer blow could result in severe burns or crushing injuries to your feet, making every step a painful reminder of your dangerous profession. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this physical strain is the archaeological evidence of skeletal remains of medieval blacksmiths. Studies of these remains often reveal distinct patterns of musculoskeletal stress, including enlarged muscle attachments, signs of severe arthritis in the spine and joints, and evidence of fractures or other traumatic injuries. These aren't just theories. The bones themselves tell a story of immense physical hardship, a silent testament to the brutal demands of the trade. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval blacksmiths often had a distinctive gait or posture due to the constant strain on their bodies. They might walk with a slight limp, or have a hunched back from years of leaning over the anvil. This physical manifestation of their labor would make them instantly recognizable in any medieval village. Imagine being able to spot a blacksmith just by the way they walk, a walking advertisement for chronic pain. It's a grim form of professional branding. Historians still argue whether the physical deformities and chronic pain experienced by medieval blacksmiths were simply accepted as an unavoidable part of the trade, or if there was any attempt, however rudimentary, to alleviate their suffering through folk remedies or rudimentary physical therapy. Either way, you were likely living with a constant companion of aches and pains, a body slowly, but surely, being hammered into submission by your own craft. Your strength was your livelihood. But it was also the very thing that was slowly destroying you. Your body, already aching from the relentless physical demands, was also under assault from an invisible enemy, the constant noise and pervasive smoke. This leads us to the grim reality of hearing loss and respiratory ills that plagued medieval blacksmiths, quietly and relentlessly eroding your senses and your ability to breathe freely. Imagine the constant clang, clang, clang of hammer on anvil, amplified by the confined space of your smithy. This wasn't just background noise, it was a percussive assault on your eardrums. Hour after hour, day after day. Over time, the subtle damage would accumulate. You wouldn't suddenly go deaf, but the higher frequencies would begin to disappear. Sounds would become muffled, and conversations would become harder to follow. You might find yourself constantly asking people to repeat themselves, or nodding along pretending to understand, even if you couldn't quite catch what was being said. It's like living in a permanent, low-level fog of sound, with the world slowly fading into a whisper. And then there was the smoke. As we talked about earlier, your forge, fueled by charcoal, produced a steady stream of smoke, carbon monoxide, and fine particulate matter, tiny, invisible bits of ash and metal dust. This toxic cocktail filled the air you breathed. Hour after hour, year after year. Your lungs, perpetually irritated, would struggle. You'd likely develop a persistent cough, especially in the mornings, bringing up phlegm that was often tinged with black. Breathing would become increasingly labored, particularly during physical exertion, and you'd find yourself wheezing or short of breath even at rest. It's like living in a permanent, localized smog advisory, but you're chained to the source. The medieval understanding of health and disease was rudimentary at best. The connection between constant noise and hearing loss, or between inhaling smoke and respiratory illness, was simply not understood. Any health issues you faced would likely be attributed to bad humors, curses, or just the will of God. Not the very air you breathed and the tools you wielded. There were no respirators, no noise-canceling earmuffs, just your unprotected senses bearing the brunt of your dangerous profession. One mainstream historical fact that supports the prevalence of respiratory issues among tradesmen like blacksmiths is the commonness of consumption, tuberculosis, and other lung diseases in medieval populations. While not exclusively caused by occupational hazards, environments filled with smoke and dust significantly increased susceptibility and worsened outcomes for such illnesses. For blacksmiths, their daily inhalation of charcoal fumes and metal particles would have made them prime candidates for chronic lung conditions, shortening their already precarious lives. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval texts sometimes mention blacksmiths having a distinctive hoarse voice or a smoker's cough, even among those who didn't necessarily smoke tobacco, which wasn't widely introduced to Europe until later. This observation, though anecdotal, points to the chronic irritation and damage to their vocal cords and lungs from the continuous inhalation of forge fumes. Imagine your voice itself becoming a telltale sign of your profession's slow destruction. It's a grim vocal signature. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effects of hearing loss and respiratory ailments primarily led to an earlier death for blacksmiths, or if they just severely diminished their quality of life, making their later years agonizingly difficult and isolating. Either way, your senses were being slowly, inexorably, taken from you, leaving you in a world that was quieter, more muffled, and harder to breathe in. So, your lungs struggled, and your hearing was fading. But the most immediate and terrifying threat in your medieval smithy was the raw power you commanded fire. This leads us directly to the constant, pervasive danger of fire hazards and burns, a daily reality that made severe injury not a possibility, but an inevitability. Imagine working inches from an open forge, a roaring furnace capable of melting iron. Sparks would constantly fly, showering your workbench, your clothes, and sometimes your exposed skin. You'd quickly learn to instinctively flinch, to swat away errant embers. But even the smallest spark could leave a stinging, blistering mark. And those were just the small ones. It's like working in a fireworks factory where every day is the 4th of July, and you're the main attraction. Beyond sparks, there was the omnipresent danger of the glowing hot metal itself. Every piece of iron you handled, from a tiny nail to a heavy plowshare, emerged from the forge at temperatures that would instantly brand your flesh. A slip of the tongs, a moment of distraction, or a misjudged swing of the hammer could send a piece of red-hot iron flying, or cause you to grasp it inadvertently. The smell of burning flesh, the searing pain of a third-degree burn, was a very real, very common experience for a blacksmith. You might carry the scars of these encounters on your hands, arms, and even face, a permanent record of your dangerous trade. The very structure of your smithy was also a fire hazard, often made of wood, with a thatched roof, and filled with flammable charcoal. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark to ignite, a runaway ember, a misplaced hot tool, or a sudden gust of wind through the open doors could quickly turn your workshop into an inferno, threatening not just your livelihood, but the entire village. You had to be constantly vigilant, pouring water to douse stray embers, sweeping up charcoal dust, and perhaps keeping a bucket of water or sand nearby. But these were rudimentary precautions at best. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this danger is the frequency of accidental fires in medieval villages. Without modern fire suppression, a fire starting in a blacksmith shop, with its abundant fuel and intense heat, could easily spread, engulfing nearby homes and sometimes entire communities. Village chronicles and legal records often mention fires that started in smithies, highlighting the constant threat they posed to their surroundings. Your smithy wasn't just your workplace. It was a potential disaster waiting to happen for everyone around you. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval blacksmiths sometimes kept a bowl of urine near their forge, believing it had properties that could soothe minor burns or clean wounds. While this might sound rather gross to us now, it speaks to the desperation and lack of effective medical knowledge for treating common workplace injuries. Imagine having a serious burn and your best cure is, well, that. It's a grim form of self-medication. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of severe burns among medieval blacksmiths contributed more to immediate fatalities, or to chronic disability and infection that ultimately shortened their lives. Regardless, every day was a gamble with fire, and the stakes were your limbs, your vision, or even your very life. You were both master of the flame and its constant, potential victim. With your body battered by work and constantly threatened by fire, your ability to simply sustain yourself was also a daily challenge. This brings us to the harsh reality of poor diet and limited sustenance that defined the life of a medieval blacksmith. Forget any notions of hearty, abundant meals. Your food would be basic, often monotonous, and barely sufficient to fuel the immense physical demands of your trade. Imagine your typical meal. It wouldn't be a lavish spread, or even a particularly varied one. Your diet would primarily consist of staples like coarse bread, often made from barley or rye, which was dense, filling, but not always easily digestible. You'd have a humble pot of pottage or stew, a thick porridge made from grains, peas, beans, or whatever seasonal vegetables were available. Cooked slowly over the fire, meat, if you got it, would be a rare treat. Perhaps a small piece of salted pork or a bit of dried fish on special occasions. Dairy products like cheese might be available, but fresh milk was less common due to spoilage. It's like eating the same bland, utilitarian meal, day in and day out, designed purely for calories, not for enjoyment or complex nutrition. The quantity of food, too, would be just enough to keep you going, but rarely enough to truly satisfy the immense caloric needs of a medieval blacksmith. Your body was constantly burning energy, sweating through long hours of hammering and stoking. You'd likely feel a perpetual dull hunger, a low-level gnawing in your stomach that was only temporarily appeased by your meager meals. This chronic undernourishment would contribute to your overall fatigue, making you more susceptible to illness and slowing your recovery from injuries. Imagine working a modern construction job on a diet of stale bread and thin gruel. You wouldn't last long. Access to food was also precarious. Your livelihood depended on the success of the harvest and the prosperity of the village. A bad harvest meant less grain, higher prices, and even scarcer food for everyone, including you. You might rely on payments in kind from farmers, a sack of grain here, a few eggs there, which further tied your diet to the agricultural cycles and vulnerabilities of the local economy. There were no supermarkets or food delivery services to bail you out. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the limitations of the medieval diet is the reliance on seasonal and local produce. Before global trade networks and modern preservation techniques, communities were almost entirely dependent on what could be grown or raised locally and what was in season. This meant diets could be very repetitive and deficient in certain nutrients, particularly vitamins and minerals found in fresh fruits and vegetables outside their harvest period. For a blacksmith, who needed every possible nutrient, this was a significant disadvantage. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval peasants, including blacksmiths, often consumed large quantities of ale or weak beer, not just for pleasure, but because it was often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated, while providing some calories and hydration. This daily consumption likely contributed to other health issues in the long run. Imagine your primary hydration source being a slightly alcoholic beverage. Day after day. It's a medieval health hack with a future hangover. Historians still argue whether the consistent, though monotonous, calorie intake from staples like bread and pottage was enough to sustain the rigorous labor of medieval blacksmiths over the long term, or if chronic nutritional deficiencies were a major contributing factor to their often early deaths and persistent health problems. Either way, your plate would be a constant reminder of your humble, hardscrabble existence, offering just enough to keep the hammer swinging, but little else. So, your stomach was often grumbling, and your body was constantly under strain. Yet, despite these hardships, you, the medieval blacksmith, occupied a peculiar place in your community's hierarchy, possessing a unique social status and village standing. You weren't a lord or a knight, but you weren't just another peasant either. You were a vital, indispensable part of village life, respected for your essential skills, yet still bound by the rigid social order of the age. Imagine yourself standing in your smithy, hot and grimy, but surrounded by the tools of your trade tools that almost no one else possessed the skill to wield. You were the keeper of fire and metal, the person who could transform raw, unyielding ore into the very fabric of medieval life. When a farmer needed a new plowshare to feed the village, they came to you. When the local lord needed a repair to his armor, or a new gate for his castle, He came to you when a knight's horse threw a shoe, preventing him from riding. He came to you. Your skills made you essential, irreplaceable. It's like being the only person in town who knows how to fix a car, a computer, and the plumbing, all at the same time. This indispensability afforded you a certain level of respect, a standing above the common peasant who simply tilled the soil. While you might still live in a humble dwelling and your clothes might be coarse, your hands, though gnarled, possessed a magic that few could replicate. You were a master of a mysterious art, capable of creating objects that sustained life, waged war, and built communities. This craftsmanship often garnered a quiet admiration from your neighbors. However, despite this respect, your position was still relatively low within the broader feudal hierarchy. You were not part of the landowning nobility or the powerful clergy. You were a laborer, a craftsman. Albeit a highly skilled one, you were likely bound to the village or manor, unable to simply pick up and leave without the lord's permission. Much like the peasants, your status was that of a commoner. Albeit a privileged commoner within your specific trade, you were more than a peasant, but less than a noble, a crucial cog, but still a cog, in the great feudal machine. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this unique standing is that blacksmiths were often among the first to be summoned or settled in new communities or castles. When a new village was established, or a castle built, a blacksmith was one of the foundational tradesmen, along with a miller or carpenter, whose presence was absolutely essential for the community to function and grow. This immediate necessity gave you a fundamental role, a reason for your very presence in the nascent settlement. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval folklore sometimes attributed magical or even supernatural powers to blacksmiths, given their ability to manipulate fire and metal, elements seen as powerful and mysterious. Some legends portrayed them as having connections to the underworld or possessing unique insights. Imagine the villagers whispering tales about your ability to tame fire, even as you just focused on not burning yourself. It's a touch of unexpected, slightly superstitious. Glamour. Historians still argue whether the perceived magic of blacksmithing, combined with their practical necessity, gave them a unique, subtle form of social influence in medieval communities, beyond their official feudal standing, or if it was simply a form of peasant awe for a complex craft. Either way, you were a figure of both respect and a little bit of mystery, a hard-working cornerstone of your village, always with a smudge of soot on your cheek. You're respected, yet still humble. Village standing came with a very practical downside: financial scarcity and debt. While your skills were essential, they didn't necessarily translate into abundant wealth. Life as a medieval blacksmith was a constant tightrope walk between earning enough to survive, providing for your family, and avoiding the dreaded grip of debt, a common affliction in a cash-poor economy. Imagine your income. It wouldn't be a steady wage paid weekly or monthly in coinage. Instead, you'd likely operate on a system of payments in kind, or small, irregular payments in coin. A farmer might pay you for sharpening his plowshare with a portion of his harvest, a sack of grain, a handful of eggs, or a chicken. The Lord might compensate you for repairing his armor with a few silver pennies, but perhaps only after months of waiting. Your income was inconsistent, dependent on the needs of your customers and their ability to pay, which in turn was dependent on the success of their own labors. It's like being a freelance contractor, but everyone pays you in potatoes. This irregular income made planning incredibly difficult. You needed raw materials, iron and charcoal, which had to be purchased, often from merchants who dealt in larger quantities and demanded actual coin. If a particularly large order came in, requiring a significant outlay for materials, you might have to borrow money, perhaps from the local lord, a wealthy merchant, or even the church. These loans, if not repaid promptly, could accumulate interest, trapping you in a cycle of indebtedness. Imagine needing to buy a large amount of raw steel for a big job, but you only have a few chickens to trade. Even basic necessities like food, clothing, and shelter, while often rudimentary, still required some form of payment or trade. If a harvest was poor, or if a plague swept through the village, your customers would have less to trade, meaning less work for you and less food for your family. You were intrinsically linked to the economic fortunes of your community, and in the medieval era, those fortunes were often precarious. One unexpected illness, one broken tool you couldn't afford to replace, or one very slow season could plunge you into financial despair. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive scarcity is the limited circulation of coinage in rural medieval economies. Much of daily life operated on barter or payments in kind. While coins existed, they were often hoarded or used for larger transactions, making it challenging for a craftsman like you to conduct business consistently in a money-based economy. This lack of readily available cash made financial planning and material acquisition incredibly difficult, often forcing reliance on credit or informal agreements. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that blacksmiths often served as the local pawnbrokers or informal bankers in their communities, lending out small sums of money or materials in exchange for future labor or goods. Imagine being both the person who needs to borrow money and the person people come to for loans, just on a much smaller scale. It's a testament to the fluid and often desperate nature of medieval financial arrangements. Historians still argue whether the constant financial precariousness of medieval artisans like blacksmiths was a deliberate mechanism by the feudal lords to keep them dependent, or simply an unavoidable consequence of a pre-industrial, agrarian economy with limited monetary systems. Regardless, your life was a constant struggle to keep your head above the financial water. With debt always looming like a dark cloud on the horizon, your constant struggle with financial scarcity meant that your very livelihood, and indeed your place in the village, was often dictated by your dependence on the lord or manor. You weren't an independent businessman in the modern sense. You were an essential, yet still subordinate, part of the feudal system, owing allegiance and often labor to the powerful figures who controlled the land. Imagine your relationship with the local lord. He wasn't just a distant ruler. He was your overlord, the owner of the land you lived on, and, often, your most important client. You might be a manorial blacksmith, meaning you were directly attached to the lord's estate, working primarily for him and his household, as well as the peasants who lived on his land. In exchange for your services, the lord might provide you with a plot of land for your house and a garden, a certain amount of grain, or perhaps protection. But this wasn't a free exchange. It was a reciprocal obligation. Where the lord held the ultimate power, it's like being an employee of a massive corporation. But the CEO also owns your house, your food supply, and decides if you get to live there. Your work for the lord would take precedence over all other tasks. If he needed repairs to his siege equipment, new horseshoes for his war horses, or iron bands for his castle gates, you dropped everything else. This could mean interrupting work for a peasant who desperately needed a tool, or delaying your own family's needs. The lord's demands were paramount, and failing to meet them could result in severe penalties, from fines to loss of your land, or even corporal punishment. You were, in essence, a crucial piece of the lord's medieval machinery, kept well-oiled but always under his control. This dependence also meant that your fortune was tied to the Lord's. A benevolent and prosperous lord might provide a relatively stable existence, ensuring the village thrived and therefore your business. A tyrannical or financially struggling lord, however, could make your life incredibly difficult, demanding more service, less payment, and offering less protection. You had very little agency to improve your circumstances if the Lord decided otherwise. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this dependence is the system of feudal obligations. While peasants owed labor on the Lord's domain, his personal land, skilled craftsmen like blacksmiths might owe specific services or a portion of their output to the Lord, often in exchange for protection, the right to operate their smithy, and access to resources like wood for charcoal from the Lord's forests. This was a fundamental part of the feudal contract, binding you tightly to the manor. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some lords would grant a blacksmith the specific right to collect charcoal from their forests, or even a small allowance of iron. As part of their service agreement, imagine getting perks that simply enabled you to do your dangerous job. Rather than giving you extra comfort, it's a medieval form of a company car, but it's just wood. Historians still argue whether the blacksmith's integration into the manorial system provided a necessary stability and protection in a volatile age, or if it primarily served as a means for the powerful elite to extract skilled labor without adequate compensation, thereby perpetuating a cycle of dependence and limited social mobility. Was it a symbiotic relationship, or just another form of soft oppression regardless? Your life was inextricably linked to the whims and fortunes of the powerful lord whose lands you called home. Your life, so tightly bound to the Lord and the rhythm of the village, was also a constant struggle against the inevitable lack of health care and healing. In a world without modern medicine, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory, every injury, every illness, and every infection was a potentially life-threatening event, leaving you to rely on folk remedies, luck, and your body's own resilience. Imagine the frequent injuries inherent in your profession: a deep cut from a sharp edge, a nasty splinter from a wooden handle, a crushing blow from a dropped hammer, or, as we discussed earlier, a severe burn from hot metal. These weren't minor inconveniences. Even a seemingly small cut could quickly become infected without proper cleaning and care, festering into a painful, debilitating wound that might require amputation or, worse, led to sepsis and death. A fractured bone, a common blacksmith injury, might be set crudely by a village elder or a traveling bone setter, leading to a crooked, painful recovery that left you with a permanent limp or weakness. It's like working in a busy emergency room, but the only medical staff are your well-meaning but utterly unqualified neighbors. Beyond injuries, you faced the same spectrum of illnesses that plagued everyone in the medieval period: dysentery, fevers, colds, and more serious diseases like the plague or smallpox, which could sweep through a village with devastating speed. For these, your options were even more limited. There were no doctors in the modern sense, certainly not in your humble village. You might rely on the local wise woman or healer, who would offer herbal concoctions, poultices, or perhaps engage in bloodletting. Practices often based on superstition or rudimentary observation rather than scientific understanding. Prayer, too, would be a common recourse. As people sought divine intervention for ailments beyond their comprehension, the lack of effective pain relief meant that recovery from injury or illness was a prolonged, agonizing ordeal. Imagine suffering from a severe burn or a broken limb. With only a few crude pain relievers, perhaps opium poppies, if you were lucky enough to find them, or just a lot of strong ale to dull the relentless ache. You'd likely be expected to return to work as soon as physically possible, even if you weren't fully healed, because your family's survival depended on your labor. There was no concept of sick leave or disability benefits. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this lack of medical care is the extremely limited surgical knowledge and antiseptic practices. Amputations, for instance, were performed only as a last resort, usually without anesthesia beyond alcohol, and with virtually no understanding of how to prevent infection. Instruments were rarely sterilized, and wounds were often dressed with unclean materials, making infection almost a certainty and greatly increasing the risk of death for a blacksmith, whose hands and feet were constantly at risk. This was a terrifying reality. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval blacksmiths often had a deep knowledge of folk remedies for muscle aches and joint pain, passed down through generations. They might concoct their own salves from local herbs or use specific massage techniques, born from their intimate understanding of physical strain. Imagine being your own primary care physician for chronic pain, mixing up a potion after a particularly grueling day at the forge. It's a testament to self-reliance, but also to the dire lack of professional medical support. Historians still argue whether the robustness of medieval immune systems, perhaps hardened by constant exposure, mitigated some of the risks of infection and illness, or if the lack of effective medical intervention simply ensured that even minor ailments could quickly become fatal for common laborers like blacksmiths. Either way, your life was a constant gamble with your own mortality, with very few cards in your hand to play against the relentless tide of sickness and injury. So, you were constantly battling illness and injury, often without proper care. But before you even reached your adult working life, your entry into the trade was just as grueling. This brings us to the harsh realities of education and apprenticeship brutality, a period where you learned your craft through arduous labor, strict discipline, and, often, physical punishment. Imagine being a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sent to live with the village blacksmith as an apprentice. This wasn't a choice for you. It was likely your family's decision, driven by necessity or the hope of securing you a trade. From day one, your education began with the most menial and physically demanding tasks. You wouldn't be hammering hot iron right away. Instead, you'd start by running errands, fetching water, hauling heavy sacks of charcoal, and endlessly working the bellows to keep the forge roaring. Your arms would ache, your back would protest, and your small hands would quickly blister from the unfamiliar labor. It's like starting your dream career by becoming an unpaid, perpetually exhausted intern for a very demanding boss. Your master, the blacksmith you apprenticed under, would be a stern taskmaster. Discipline was harsh and immediate. Mistakes, whether in handling tools, stoking the fire, or simply not working fast enough, could be met with a sharp cuff to the ear, a blow from a wooden stick, or a stern, public reprimand. There was no gentle encouragement or structured curriculum as we understand it today. Learning was largely by observation and imitation, with correction coming swiftly and often painfully. You learned to be quick, precise, and obedient, not just for the sake of the craft, but for your own physical well-being. The apprenticeship would last for many years, often 7 or more, stretching through your entire adolescence. During this time, you would live in your master's household, entirely dependent on him for food, lodging, and clothing, which would be basic at best. You were essentially an unpaid servant, exchanging your labor for the chance to learn a valuable skill. The hours were long, the work repetitive, and genuine rest was a luxury. You learned to forge not just metal, but also resilience and endurance in the face of constant physical and mental pressure. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this widespread practice is the formal nature of medieval apprenticeships, though often unwritten for village crafts. The system of binding a young person to a master for a set number of years, providing labor in exchange for training and sustenance, was a cornerstone of medieval craft guilds and trades. This system ensured the transmission of specialized skills from one generation to the next. Albeit through a rigorous and often harsh process, your apprenticeship was a foundational rite of passage, turning a boy into a man, and a commoner into a craftsman. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that part of your education might involve sleeping in the smithy itself, or a small adjoining room, to ensure you were always on hand for early morning tasks or urgent late-night repairs. Imagine your bedroom being perpetually smoky, noisy, and smelling of hot metal, even when the forge was dormant. It's a literal immersion in your craft. 24/7. Historians still argue whether the brutal nature of medieval apprenticeships, while undeniably harsh, ultimately produced more highly skilled and resilient craftsmen, or if it simply broke the spirit of many and discouraged innovation. Did it forge strong artisans, or merely survivors regardless? Your path to becoming a master of metal was paved with sweat, pain, and a constant, demanding test of your limits. So, your brutal apprenticeship honed your skills, but once you became a journeyman or a master blacksmith, new challenges arose: competition and guild restrictions. You weren't operating in a vacuum. You were part of a complex economic landscape, often constrained by rules and rivalries that dictated who could work, what they could charge, and how they could operate. Imagine setting up your own smithy in a town or city. If you were in a larger urban center, you'd quickly encounter the power of the guilds. These were powerful associations of craftsmen that controlled access to your trade. To become a master blacksmith and open your own shop, you would typically need to be accepted into the local blacksmith's guild. This meant proving your skill often by creating a masterpiece piece of work, paying fees, and adhering to their strict rules. It's like trying to open a new business today. But you need permission from a powerful, old-school club that controls everything. These guilds, while sometimes providing a safety net for members like mutual aid in times of illness, primarily existed to protect their members' interests. This often meant limiting competition. They would set strict prices for common items, dictate the quality of goods, and even control the number of apprentices a master could take on. This was great for established masters, ensuring steady prices and limiting new rivals. But it could make it incredibly difficult for a new blacksmith to break into the market or innovate beyond traditional methods. If you tried to undercut prices, or produce something that deviated from the guild standards, you could face severe penalties, from fines to expulsion from the trade altogether. Even in a smaller village without a formal guild, you'd still face competition, albeit on a less organized scale. If another blacksmith set up shop nearby, or if a traveling tinker offered cheaper though perhaps lower quality repairs, it could directly impact your meager income. You'd constantly be balancing the need to make a living with maintaining your reputation for quality and fair pricing. It's a bit like being a small business owner in a competitive market. But without any modern advertising, just word of mouth and the quality of your horseshoes. The restrictions weren't just about money. They were about tradition and hierarchy. Guilds often had elaborate rituals, strict social hierarchies within their ranks: apprentice, journeyman, master, and specific rules about how work was performed. Deviation from these norms could be seen as disrespectful, or even a threat to the established order. you were expected to conform, to fit into the existing structure, rather than trying to disrupt it. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully demonstrates these restrictions is the control over raw materials exercised by guilds. Guilds often had agreements with suppliers or even direct control over the import of iron and charcoal, ensuring their members had access while making it difficult for non-guild blacksmiths to acquire materials at a reasonable price. This was a significant barrier to entry and a powerful tool for maintaining their monopoly. Imagine needing a specific type of metal, but only the club members can buy it. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval guilds often had their own patron saints, holidays, and elaborate social functions, including lavish feasts. While these offered a sense of community, they also reinforced the exclusivity and internal hierarchy of the guild. Imagine having to pay dues to a club that controls your entire livelihood, and then having to attend mandatory parties where you're constantly reminded of your lower rank. It's a mix of professional obligation and awkward social dynamics. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds primarily fostered economic stability and quality control within trades, or if they were largely protectionist rackets that stifled innovation and limited social mobility for aspiring craftsmen. Was it a supportive community, or a stifling monopoly for you? The medieval blacksmith. Navigating this world of competition and rules was just another layer of stress in an already difficult existence. So, your professional life was a tightrope walk between adhering to guild rules and fending off rivals. But beyond the forge, the very human need for family often came with its own set of burdens, leading to family life and inherited misery, while you might find solace and love within your humble home. The harsh realities of your profession often meant that your children were destined for a similar, difficult path, perpetuating a cycle of toil. Imagine looking at your own children. You love them dearly, and you work ceaselessly to provide for them. Your wife, if you are married, shares in the labor, often helping with tasks around the smithy, managing the household, and raising your brood. Your children might play among the tools, accustomed to the clang of the hammer and the smell of smoke, but as they grow, the grim reality sets in their future. Like yours, is largely predetermined by your trade and your social standing. It's like living in a time loop, where the next generation is almost guaranteed to repeat the struggles of the last. For your sons, particularly, there was often little choice but to follow in your footsteps. Apprenticeship to a blacksmith, perhaps even to you, was a common trajectory. This meant that the same grueling physical demands, the same dangers of the forge, the same exposure to smoke and noise, would become their inheritance. You would teach them the craft, instilling in them the skills that defined your miserable existence, knowing that you were passing on not just a trade, but a lifetime of aches, pains, and perpetual struggle. It's like teaching your child to drive, but you know the car only goes uphill and has terrible brakes. For your daughters, their lives would also be difficult, often intertwined with the smithy. They might assist with lighter tasks, manage household chores, raise their own children, and eventually marry into a similar life of hardship, perhaps to another craftsman or a farmer. While they might avoid the direct physical toll of the forge, their lives would be characterized by a different set of hardships. From childbirth in unhygienic conditions to constant domestic labor, the financial precariousness you faced would also be inherited. Your children would grow up understanding that money was scarce, that food was often basic, and that comfort was a luxury rarely afforded. They would learn frugality out of necessity and would understand that their future depended on relentless hard work. Just like yours, the idea of upward social mobility, of escaping the cycle of artisanal labor, was largely a fantasy for most. One mainstream historical fact that underlines this inherited path is the strong tradition of hereditary trades in medieval Europe. Crafts and professions, like blacksmithing, were often passed down from father to son. This wasn't always a legal mandate, but a powerful social and economic norm. Skills were learned within the family unit, and it was the most natural, and often the only viable, path for a son to secure a livelihood. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval surnames, like Smith, or variations like Schmidt, Ferrero, Fabri, directly originated from the profession of blacksmith, indicating just how central and ubiquitous the trade was in the lives and identities of families for generations. Imagine your entire family's identity being forever linked to the clang of an anvil. It's a permanent echo of your hard labor. Historians still argue whether the strong tradition of inherited trades, despite its social constraints, provided a necessary stability and transmission of vital skills across generations, or if it primarily served to reinforce social immobility and limit individual aspiration within the medieval class structure. Did it create a stable society, or just perpetuate hardship for you, the medieval blacksmith? Your family was your solace, your reason for enduring, but also a poignant reminder that the heavy hammer of your profession would likely be wielded by your children, and their children, after you. So, your family shared in the burdens of your trade. Yet, despite the endless toil, the bodily decay, and the financial struggles, you, the medieval blacksmith, held an undeniable place as a community role and essential service. You were the silent, soot-stained backbone of your village, whose skills were not merely convenient but absolutely vital for the very survival and functioning of medieval life. Imagine your village without you. The farmer's plow breaks, and there's no one to repair it. Threatening the spring planting, the cartwheel falls apart, stranding goods and people. The castle gate hinges seize, compromising defense. The village well needs a new winch, without which water becomes a scarce commodity. Without a blacksmith, the intricate web of medieval life would unravel piece by piece. You were the practical problem solver, the fixer, the maintainer of the tools that made life, however harsh, possible. It's like being the only IT support technician in a remote town, where every single piece of technology eventually breaks and relies on you. This essential role gave you a unique status. While you might not be at the top of the social hierarchy, your presence was non-negotiable. You were often among the first few specialized craftsmen to be brought into a new settlement. Alongside the miller or the baker, your workshop, often located centrally, was a hub of activity, a place where villagers would gather not just for repairs, but to exchange news, gossip, and perhaps even seek rudimentary advice. You were a witness to daily life, privy to the struggles and triumphs of your neighbors, seeing the wear and tear of their tools reflecting the wear and tear of their lives. Your work was a constant cycle of creation and repair, directly contributing to the sustenance and security of your community. You forged the nails for their homes, the hinges for their doors, the tools for their fields, and the weapons for their defense. You weren't just making objects, you were literally forging the fabric of medieval existence. One hammer blow at a time, this fundamental contribution, though often unheralded in grand histories, made you a pillar of your local society. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this vital role is the ubiquity of the blacksmith's forge in almost every medieval settlement. Regardless of size, from the smallest hamlet to the largest city, a blacksmith was a fundamental necessity. This pervasive presence isn't just an anecdotal observation. It reflects the deep and constant need for metal tools and repairs in a pre-industrial society where metal objects were both valuable and prone to breakage. Your very existence was a testament to the Iron Age. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval children, fascinated by the sparks and glow of the forge, would often gather to watch the blacksmith work, treating it as a form of entertainment or spectacle. Imagine trying to concentrate on hitting a glowing piece of metal with precision, while a gaggle of wide-eyed kids peer over your shoulder. It's a small, slightly distracting testament to the mesmerizing power of your craft. Historians still argue whether the essential role of blacksmiths and other skilled artisans in medieval communities provided them with a greater degree of bargaining power or autonomy against their feudal lords, or if their indispensability simply made them more tightly bound to their service, as their skills were too valuable to be lost. Did your vital role offer freedom, or just a heavier chain? Despite the hardships, your hands were literally shaping the world around you, a testament to the quiet, crucial power of your craft. You felt the weight of that essential role, the constant forging of a community's very existence, but for all the necessity and the quiet respect, the cumulative impact of your profession led to one undeniable, grim reality: early death and shortened life. A blacksmith's life was typically a brutal, arduous journey that, more often than not, ended prematurely. Worn down by the relentless demands of your craft, imagine your body at middle age, perhaps in your late 30s or early 40s, while your peers who toiled in the fields might be experiencing their own aches and pains. Your body would likely be far more ravaged. Your joints would ache perpetually. Your back would be a constant source of agony, and your breathing would be shallow and wheezing from years of smoke inhalation. Your hearing, as we discussed, would be significantly diminished, making communication a challenge. You might have missing teeth from accidental blows, or be scarred from countless burns. Your once strong hands, the very instruments of your trade, would likely be gnarled and crippled by arthritis, making every hammer blow a torment. It's like your body was a machine designed for heavy use, but it was forced into overdrive every single day, without proper maintenance, until it simply broke down. The combination of relentless physical exertion, chronic fatigue, poor nutrition, constant exposure to smoke and dust, and frequent, often untreated, injuries created a perfect storm for a shortened lifespan. Your body's ability to heal and recover would be constantly compromised. A common cold could easily escalate into a deadly respiratory infection. A minor cut could become a fatal case of sepsis. A simple fall could result in a bone fracture that never healed properly, rendering you unable to work and thus unable to sustain yourself. There were no retirement plans, no disability benefits. If you couldn't work, you often couldn't eat. The medieval period itself was fraught with dangers, famine, plague, warfare, that contributed to generally lower life expectancies for everyone. But for you, the blacksmith, your profession layered additional, specific risks that ensured your life would be even briefer and more painful than that of the average peasant. You were literally burning out, fueling the needs of your community with the dwindling flames of your own vitality. One mainstream historical fact that chillingly illustrates this is the skeletal evidence from medieval cemeteries. Archaeological studies often reveal that individuals identified as blacksmiths based on skeletal markers of intense, specific physical stress and trauma consistently show signs of severe degenerative diseases, widespread injuries, and often died at younger ages compared to the general population. The very bones tell the tale of a life cut short by hard labor and hazardous conditions, A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval blacksmiths were said to have a characteristic blackened appearance, not just from soot, but from the cumulative effect of constant heat and smoke, giving their skin a weathered, almost leathery look. Imagine your very skin carrying the mark of your trade, a physical testament to your constant exposure, like a permanent tan from hell. It's a visible sign of the life being drained from you. Historians still argue whether the perceived toughness and resilience required of medieval blacksmiths actually led to a greater stoicism in the face of pain and hardship, or if it simply meant they had no choice but to endure profound suffering until their inevitable. Early demise. Did it build character, or just hasten the end for you, the medieval blacksmith? Your life was a fleeting, fiery spark, consumed too quickly by the very flames you mastered, leaving behind a legacy of iron, forged at the cost of your own precious years. Now, let the clang of the hammer, the roar of the forge, and the smell of hot iron gently fade away. The smoke clears, the heat subsides, and the aches in your imaginary bones soften into a distant memory. There's no more heavy lifting, no more blinding sparks, no more relentless noise here. Just the quiet hum of your fan, the soft comfort of your bed, and the profound stillness of the night. You can release the imagined burdens of that hard medieval life, the weary body, the constant dangers, and the early end, that demanding existence, with all its grime and grit, belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.